The last hearth part. 1. The smell of fire. She had $10 in a canvas rucksack and a cast iron Dutch oven that had been seasoned black by 10,000 fires and still smelled faintly like everything her grandmother had ever cooked in it. The $10 came from the last envelope of tip money she had been saving in the sock at the bottom of the rucksack, the one she kept meaning to put in a real bank account and never did because there had never been enough to matter. Until now, there was exactly enough to matter in a very specific way. The boarding house on Ridley Street had been condemned on a Thursday. Not condemned in the way things got condemned slowly, with meetings and warnings and a reasonable timeline for relocation. Condemned the way certain institutions delivered bad news, a single yellow notice stapled to the front door by a county inspector who had not looked apologetic about it. Structural failure in the east foundation wall, 14 days. After that, the county would take it. Nell Carey was 23 years old. She had 6 pairs of socks, 4 shirts, 1 good sweater, a photograph, and a Dutch oven. She had been working the pot scrubbing shift at Carver's Diner on Route 11 since she was 19, 8 hours a night, $12 an hour, which was not enough to save anything real, but was enough to eat and pay rent on a room in a building that had until Thursday not been condemned. She sat on the front step of the condemned building on a Friday morning and counted her money. $10. She thought about this for a long time. Okay. $10 is actually not a lot. She had the Dutch oven because her grandmother Ada had pressed it into her hands the week before she died with the specific urgency of a woman who understood which objects carried meaning and which ones didn't. "This goes with you," Ada had said. "Wherever you end up, this goes." The oven was a 12-inch lodge, black as midnight, the interior so well seasoned it looked like oil and felt like glass. Ada had baked cornbread in it every single day for 28 years, and before that her own grandmother had cooked in it, and before that the provenance got fuzzy in the way that the history of useful objects always got fuzzy. It weighed 11 pounds. Nell carried it everywhere. She also had the photograph. Ada, at her own hearth in 1988, face lit from below by coal glow, the way faces were lit in the era before everyone stood under fluorescent overhead lights and looked exhausted. Ada had been 48 in that photograph, and she had looked 48 in the way that women who had been standing in front of fire for 30 years looked 48, strong, not ageless, not preserved, just strong in the particular way of people who had been doing difficult physical work for so long that the difficulty had become invisible part of the posture. Ada. Carey had run the boarding house on the south end of Route 11 outside Milford, Virginia, for 28 years. It was not a country inn. It was not a bed and breakfast. It was a boarding house, a plain 2-story building with 6 rooms upstairs and a kitchen downstairs that served 3 meals a day to whoever walked through the door. The people who walked through the door had been truckers and construction workers and traveling salesmen and the occasional migrant farm laborer and families passing through the valley on their way to somewhere that had not yet disappointed them. The meals were plain: beans and cornbread, pot roast and potatoes, biscuits with gravy the color of cream and the consistency of a promise being kept, fried chicken and greens cooked with fatback and apple cider vinegar and whatever Ada had decided that morning needed to go in. Every single meal cooked on the stone hearth that Eli Carey, Ada's husband, who had died 11 years before her and who had been, by all accounts, an extraordinarily careful stonemason, had built in 1966 from limestone he had quarried himself from the hillside behind the property. Ada had never used the electric stove Eli had installed the same year. She had used it as a shelf. The hearth was her kitchen. The kitchen was the reason people came back, and people came back because food cooked over hardwood coals tasted like something that food cooked on a gas range or a flat-top grill did not taste like. It tasted like effort. It tasted like time. It tasted like somebody on the other side of the fire had been paying attention. Ada had put Nell to work at 5. Not play work. Not make Nell feel included work. Real work. The kind that mattered to the outcome of the meal and that people were counting on and that had to be done correctly. At 5, Nell's job had been fire tending, carrying kindling from the wood box to the hearth, feeding the fire when the coals got low, learning to read the coals the way Ada read them, not with a thermometer, not with a timer, but with her eyes and her nose and the accumulated knowledge of someone who had done this for a very long time. "What color is that?" Ada would say, pointing. "Red-orange," Nell would say. "That's 400 degrees, good for baking. What about that white-gray? 600, good for searing. And that one, dark red, 250. Put your beans on now if you want them ready for supper. Don't put them on the white-gray. You'll cook all the patience out of them." She was not reading a thermometer. She was reading fire the way you read fire, which was the way you read anything worth understanding, by standing close enough to feel it and paying enough attention to know what you were looking at. By 7, Nell was cooking on the hearth. The first thing she made was cornbread. Ada stood beside her and did not touch the bowl, did not touch the Dutch oven, did not touch the coals. She only watched and said when the batter was poured and the lid was on and the oven was set in the ashes with coals raked onto the lid from above, "Don't peek." Nell had wanted to peek. She had not peeked. "The bread tells you when it's done," Ada said, settling into her chair beside the hearth. "Listen for it to stop sizzling. When it stops sizzling, it's set. When it starts smelling like toast, it's done. If it smells like burning, you waited too long." The sizzle slowed. The smell shifted from batter to toast. Nell had pulled the lid. The cornbread was golden on top and brown on the bottom, and the crumb was dense and moist, and the truck driver who ate the first slice, a man named Roy, who had been eating at Ada's 3 times a week since 1992, had set his fork down and looked at Ada and said, "Who made this?" Ada had said, "My granddaughter." Roy had said, "She's 7. Ada had said, "She's been standing at this hearth since she was 5. The hearth doesn't know how old she is." Roy had looked at Nell the way certain people looked at small children who did something unexpected, which was to say, with sudden recalibration. Then he had gone back to eating, which was the correct response. By 10, Nell was cooking full dinners, managing 4 pots on the crane at once, rotating each one to control the heat zones, because a hearth had heat zones, the way a stove did not, because the fire was 3-dimensional and had sides and a top and a bottom and a distance, and you learned to use all of them. Or you learned that your beans were boiling when they should have been simmering, and your bread was raw in the center, and your meat was done on the outside and wrong all the way through. By 13, she could cook for 12 people without help. A construction foreman named Hector, who ate at the boarding house 3 nights a week, told Ada one evening that the beans tasted different when Nell cooked. Ada had said they were the same beans. Hector had said they tasted different. They tasted more patient. Ada had liked that answer. She had told Nell later, "He's right. Your beans are more patient than mine. I rush the simmer. Always have. 28 years, and I still rush it because I've been doing it for 28 years, and I think I already know. You've been doing it for 8 years. You still pay attention." She had looked at the fire. That's the difference between a cook who's been standing here that long and a cook who just started. The longer you do it, the more you have to fight the assumption that you know. Nell had been 13 and she had filed this away. She was still filing it. On summer evenings after supper, when the boarders had gone upstairs and the kitchen was clean and the coals were banked for the night, Ada and Nell sat on the porch in the dark, and Ada told her about the old inn. There was a stagecoach inn 5 miles south on Old Valley Road. It had been built in 1843 by a man named Caleb Orrin, who had operated it as a stopping point for travelers heading south through the valley on the old road before Route 11 existed. The inn had fed and housed travelers for 69 years, 3 generations of the Orrin family, standing at a hearth that was, according to Ada, the largest stone hearth in Augusta County. 6 feet wide, 4 feet tall, a rotating crane that could hold 6 pots at once, a spit jack, a clockwork mechanism that turned the roasting spit using a weight and gear system, the kind imported from England, mounted in the right wall. The brass gears had been the only spit jack in the Shenandoah Valley in 1843, and Caleb Orrin had been so proud of it that he had listed it separately in his will. The man left the spit jack to his son and the inn to his wife. Ada said, once in the dark on the porch, the fireflies beginning in the field behind the house. That tells you what he valued most. The inn had closed in 1912, when the automobile made the stagecoach obsolete and the road that had served the valley for 70 years went quiet. The last Orrin, a man named Samuel Caleb's grandson, had locked the door and walked away. Ada had walked the 2 miles down Old Valley Road to stand in front of it many times. She had never gone inside. Why not? Nell had asked once. She had been 12, and she had been at the age when the unanswered questions about adults became interesting rather than simply confusing. Ada had looked at the dark field for a long time before she answered. I wasn't ready, she said, and then there were other reasons. Nell had not pushed it. You learned living with Ada when to push and when to let a thing be. Ada had also told Nell across those summer evenings on the porch about Maggie, her great-great-grandmother, a woman who had lived on the south end of Augusta County her entire life, had never had much money, but had always, Ada said this with a particular satisfaction, always had a proper hearth. Maggie Carey, born before the Civil War, who had known the Shenandoah Valley roads by the feel of them and who had cooked the kind of food that people remembered after they left the table. She knew the old inn, Ada said once. Before it closed, she used to stop there on her way to Staunton. What was it like? Nell had asked. She said the hearth was the biggest thing she'd ever seen in a kitchen. She said the man who ran it at the time, Samuel, something fed people the way the place was built to feed people, like it was the whole point, like nothing else mattered while the food was on the table. Ada had looked at the dark field. She was right about that, Ada said. That's what a hearth is. Nothing else matters while the food is on the table. You don't ask where they're going or who they are or whether they can pay. You just feed them. Ada. Carrie died on a Sunday morning in March, 3 years after she had sold the boarding house and moved back into the small house on Ridley Street. She died in her chair beside the hearth, which was cold. She had not lit the boarding house hearth since selling the business, holding the ladle she had used for 28 years to serve beans from the pot on the crane. The ladle was warm from her hands. She had been 81 years old. Nell had been 20. She had taken the ladle. She had taken the Dutch oven. She had taken the photograph of Ada at the boarding house hearth in 1988, face lit by coals. She had put all 3 in the canvas rucksack, and she had been carrying them since. After Ada's death, Nell had taken a room in the condemned boarding house on Ridley Street and kept working the pot scrubbing shift at Carver's Diner. $12 an hour, 8 hours a night, 5 nights a week. She had not cooked at the diner. The diner cooked on a flat-top grill and 2 deep fryers, and Nell had understood in her first week what Ada had tried to tell her. A flat-top grill was to a hearth what a flashlight was to a fire. It produced light, not the same light. She had scrubbed the pots and kept her mouth shut and saved what she could, which was not much, which was $10. On a Friday morning, she sat on the front step of a condemned building in Milford, Virginia, with $10 and a Dutch oven and a photograph of a woman who had taught her everything she knew about fire. She picked up the free weekly paper from the recycle bin by the front door, the Augusta County Shopper, 4 pages, classifieds, yard sale listings, church announcements, a column about the county fair. She turned to the back page out of habit, the way you turn to the back page of a free paper, because that was where the strange things ended up. County surplus section, 3 listings, a storage unit, a parcel of gravel easement, and stone building, approximately 1,800 square feet on 1.2 acres Old Valley Road, south of Milford, built 1843, former used inn, asking $10, contact Augusta County Clerk. Nell read it 3 times. The second time was to make sure she had read it right. The third time was because she needed a moment before she understood what she was deciding. She had $10. The county clerk's office was on Court Square in Staunton. Nell walked 2 miles to the highway and got a ride from a woman in a Ford pickup who was going to Staunton to pick up a grandchild and who asked no questions and offered a cup of coffee from a thermos, and that was enough. The clerk's office smelled like paper and air conditioning and the institutional neutrality of places that process transactions without judgment. A man in his 60s sat behind the front desk with reading glasses on a lanyard and the look of a man who had been sitting behind that desk for a very long time and had developed his own philosophy about the people who came through the door. His name was Mr. Garrett. He looked at Nell over his glasses. "Orin's Rest Inn," he said. "Old Valley Road." "Yes, sir." He looked at her. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a file. "You know the building hasn't been used since 1912. "I know. No electric, no plumbing, no septic, foundations cracked on the south side." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the file. He looked at Nell. "Your grandmother was Ada Carey," he said. Not a question. Nell's hands were still. "Yes. She asked about this property." He said it carefully, not casually. "Over the years, she asked about buying it." A pause. There were complications with the title that prevented a sale for a long time. Those complications have since resolved. He closed the file. "The county is clearing the lien, $10 and the property transfers." Nell put the $10 bill on the counter. Mr. Garrett picked it up. He looked at it for a moment. Then he opened another drawer, found a deed form, and began filling it out. "The key is on a hemp cord," he said. "Iron, heavy, don't lose it." He handed it to her across the counter. Old Valley Road ran south from Milford through rolling farmland. The Shenandoah Valley spread out on both sides with the Blue Ridge on one horizon and the Alleghenies on the other. October light coming in low from the west, the kind of late afternoon light that turned limestone golden and made the hayfields look like they were lit from underneath. Nell walked. She had Ada's ladle in the rucksack, the Dutch oven, the photograph, the iron key on the hemp cord. She walked 2 miles down a road that had been old when Virginia was young and thought about the fact that Ada had walked this same road many times and had never made it all the way to the door. The inn was on a low rise set back from the road, a 2-story limestone building, standing seam tin roof, wide front porch with limestone columns that had been quarried from the same hillside as the walls, a massive central chimney rising above the roofline, a heavy oak door with iron strap, hinges the wood weathered silver gray, and the smell, not a burning smell, not rot, not mildew exactly, though there was that too, something under all of it, something old and layered and specific the way certain smells were specific to places that had held a particular kind of work for a long time. Wood smoke, faint, 112 years faint, but there, because limestone held things, because a stone hearth that had cooked 3 meals a day for 69 years put something into the walls that did not leave just because the fire went out. She put the iron key in the lock. It turned. The ground floor was one large room. The common room where the travelers had eaten and sat by the fire and dried their boots and told each other about the road ahead. Limestone walls blackened with age in the corners, wide plank chestnut floor, dusty and scratched but solid, heavy timber beams overhead, 2 long windows on each side wall shuttered from inside, letting thin blades of October light through the gaps, and against the back wall the hearth, 6 feet wide, 4 feet tall. The limestone around the firebox was blackened from floor to mantel, stained by 69 years of cooking fires in the specific way that cooking fires stain things differently from decorative fires, deeper and darker and more complex, because cooking fires burned longer and hotter and more purposefully. The rotating crane was still in place, the iron arm extending from the left wall on a pivot with 6 hooks at varying heights, not rusted through, rusted but intact, the way iron was intact when it had been built well enough to last. In the right wall of the firebox, the spitjack, brass gears and an iron arm, the clockwork weight mechanism that had turned a roasting spit for 69 years, imported from England, the only one in the Shenandoah Valley, green with age, but intact, every gear visible, the weight hanging at the bottom of the mechanism where it had been when the last fire went out in 1912. Nell stood in front of the hearth for a long time. She thought Ada. Ada stood in front of this and walked away. 17 times, Mr. Garrett said. Ada stood in front of this hearth and then went back to her own. Why? To the right of the hearth, a narrow stone staircase descended through the floor into darkness, the root cellar, cool air rising from below, the smell of earth and stone and the particular deep cold of a space that had been sealed for a long time and had kept whatever it held at exactly the same temperature, regardless of what was happening above it. She lit the small battery lantern from her rucksack, descended. Stone walls, packed earth floor, vaulted ceiling, the arch of it low enough that she had to duck slightly in the center. The cellar had been used for food storage, root vegetables, preserved meats, cider barrels. The earthen floor still held the indentations of barrel rims in 2 parallel lines along the left wall. Along the back wall, on a stone shelf that was part of the foundation itself, sat a wooden box, iron corner brackets, a hinged lid, the kind of box that a person built when they wanted something to last. Not a decorative box, not a jewelry box, a working box. The wood was still sound because the cellar was the driest room in a stone building, and what was stored cool and dry would keep. She opened it, a leather tool roll tied with cord. She unrolled it on the earthen floor. Hand-forged iron tools, a spitjack winding key, 4 trivets of graduating sizes, a rotating crane arm extension that would double the reach of the crane above, and 3 copper ladles with iron handles, a match set, the copper gone green, but the shape of them still exact. Beside the tool roll, a heavy canvas pouch tied at the neck. She opened the pouch. Gold coins, round, heavy, the size of a large button. She tilted one toward the lantern light. An eagle, the Liberty head facing left, a date 1873, another 1847, another 1901, 40 coins in total. She counted them twice. Liberty quarter eagles $2.50, gold pieces dated between 1843 and 1911. 1 coin for nearly every year the inn had been open, as if someone had been setting one aside, each year a record kept, not in a ledger but in gold. She did not know what 40 Liberty quarter eagles were worth. She thought a lot more than $10. And beneath both the tool roll and the canvas pouch, a thick, leather-bound book. She lifted it carefully. The cover was embossed in faded gilt lettering, Orins Restin. Inn Guest Register, 1843. She opened it. The first page was dense with handwriting, a name, a place of origin, a destination, a date. the next page the same, and the next. Thousands of entries covering 69 years, the handwriting changing across the decades the way all handwriting changed when different hands held the pen. The early pages in a careful, deliberate script. Someone who had learned to write when writing was taught as a craft. The middle years in a bolder hand, faster, more confident. The final pages in a pencil that had pressed hard, the letters slanting forward. She turned to the last page. One entry, March 14th, 1912. Mr. James Doyle, Richmond to Lexington, traveling by motor car. Below it, in the same hand, the last guest. God keep the road. Tucked inside the back cover, a folded letter. She unfolded it carefully. The paper was heavy rag stock, the kind that lasted. The writing was in ink brown with age, in the same hurried pencil hand as the final ledger entries. To whoever finds this cellar, my name is Samuel Orrin. I am the grandson of Caleb Orrin, who built this inn in 1843 and who ran it until his death in 1870. My father ran it after him. I have run it since 1894. Today is the 16th of March, 1912. I am closing this house because the motor car has made the road different and the stagecoach does not run anymore, and an inn without stagecoaches is an inn without purpose, which is a sad thing to write, but is the truth. I am leaving the hearth tools and the coins and this ledger in the cellar, because the cellar is the driest and coolest room in a stone building, and what is stored cool and dry will keep. The ledger is the record of every person who ate at this hearth and slept under this roof for 69 years. It cannot be replaced. The tools are what we use to feed them. Feed the next traveler who comes through the door. Samuel Orrin, innkeeper, March 16th, 1912. Nell read the letter twice. Then she held it and looked at the stone ceiling of the root cellar for a while and thought about nothing in particular. Then she picked up the guest ledger and turned back through the pages, page by page, the handwriting shifting, names from everywhere. Staunton to Lexington, Richmond to Harrisonburg, Natural Bridge to Front Royal, the Valley Turnpike running both ways for 69 years, and this hearth on the side of it like a fixed point. She was going slowly now, looking at the names, the Civil War pages, 1863. Here the names came in clusters, sometimes 6 or 8 per day, and the origins were sparse, just a rank and a unit and a direction, some Union, some Confederate, side by side on the same pages, eating at the same hearth, because Caleb Orrin had understood that a hungry soldier, regardless of which hungry soldiers he agreed with, was still a hungry soldier. She kept turning. She was almost at the front of the book. 1908. She stopped. The entry read, Mrs. Margaret Maggie Carey, Greenville to Staunton, April 1908. Beside it, in a different ink, a note added later in what she recognized as Caleb Orrin Jr.'s bolder hand. This woman knows the smell of right fire. Nell did not move for a long time. She turned back one more page. 1903. Mrs. Margaret Carey, Greenville to Staunton, and before that, 4 pages earlier. 1897. Margaret Carey, Greenville to Staunton, first visit, 3 times. 1908. The same woman, the same road, the same direction. Margaret Carey, Maggie. She reached into the rucksack and took out the photograph of Ada at the boarding house hearth, looked at it in the lantern light. Ada had told her about Maggie, rarely, briefly, the way you mention ancestors whose stories you had inherited, in fragments, a name here, a fact there, the lineage, growing vague the further back you went. Ada's grandmother's mother, born before the Civil War, lived on the south end of Augusta County her whole life, knew the valley roads by feel, always a proper hearth. Maggie Carey, Nell's great-great-grandmother, who had walked into this inn 3 times, in 1897, in 1903, in 1908, and eaten at this hearth, and been noted in the ledger not just by name but by what she knew. This woman knows the smell of right fire. The lantern hummed softly. The root cellar was very still. Outside, the October wind moved through the Shenandoah Valley, the way it always had, down from the mountains and across the farmland and around the limestone walls of a building that had been standing since 1843 and had fed everyone who came to it and had held in its cellar the record of every one of those people for 112 years. Nell pressed her palm flat on the stone floor. Cool and solid and very old, she said quietly to the cellar, to the ledger, to the entry that read, Margaret Carey, first visit, 1897. Ada, you knew? The fire above had been cold since 1912. She was about to change that. Part 2. The cost of the fire, the chimney first, before anything else. Before the floor was swept, or the shutters were open, or the crane arm was tested for weight, the chimney had to be cleared. 112 years of creosote and nesting material and whatever else had found its way into the flue of a stone building standing open to the Shenandoah Valley sky since 1912. Nell borrowed a chimney brush from a sweep in Staunton, a man named Hale, who had the look of someone who had spent 30 years covered in soot and had made his peace with it. He drove out on a Tuesday morning, looked up at the chimney cap and said the raccoon family had moved on, but the creosote was substantial. He quoted her a number she didn't have. She told him she'd do it herself. He looked at her for a moment, then handed her the brush and an extra length of rod and said the first rule was to seal the firebox opening before you started from the top, or you'd breathe black for a week. She sealed the firebox opening with a piece of canvas from the hardware store in Milford. She climbed the limestone walls. The view from the roofline of Orrin's Rest Inn was the Shenandoah Valley. In October, which was the Shenandoah Valley, in its full argument, the ridge lines of the Alleghenies and the Blue Ridge on opposite horizons, the farmland between them going gold and rust and brown, the old road running south through all of it in a line you could follow with your eye until it disappeared around a curve in the hillside. The valley had looked like this more or less when Caleb Orrin built this chimney in 1843. The road had looked like this. The mountains hadn't moved. She worked the brush down the flue. The creosote fell in thick black chunks. The nesting material from 40 years of birds followed it down. She could hear it hitting the canvas below. She worked methodically, section by section, the rod extending further down the flue with each pass. Mr. Garrett's truck appeared on the road below. He parked. He got out. He looked up at her on the roof. "You're going to need someone at the bottom," he said. "I'm aware," she said. He went inside. They worked for 4 hours. Mr. Garrett shoveled debris from the canvas into feed sacks he'd brought in the back of his truck. Nell worked the brush from above. By noon, the flue was clear and the firebox was clean and the damper worked and the draft was good. Mr. Garrett sat on the porch step with a bottle of water and looked at the valley. He said, "Your grandmother tried to buy this property 17 times. Nell sat down on the step. She had known something, not that specific, but something. "When?" she said. "First time was 2001. She came in, asked about the property, was told there was a complication with the title." He drank some water. "Second time, 2003. Same answer. The complications were real. There was a genuine chain of title issue that took years to untangle. But by 2011 or so, when the title was clear, the complications were of a different kind." Nell waited. "A man named Colt Basham." Mr. Garrett said the name carefully, the way you said names you had opinions about. "He'd been filing objections every time your grandmother inquired. Not legal challenges, not formal claims, just objections. Letters to the county expressing interest in the property for development purposes. It was enough to delay proceedings indefinitely without actually doing anything." He paused. "He does that. He's done it with other properties in the county. He parks himself on something cheap and waits for the situation to change. Nell looked at the limestone wall of the inn. Ada had known about this building since she was young, had walked this road, had tried 17 times to do what Nell had done on a Thursday morning with a $10 bill and a deed form. Why did the objections stop, she said. Basham submitted a development contract 3 years ago, Mr. Garrett said. He thought that would move things along, but the council member who co-signed that contract lost his position in the next election, and the contract was never ratified. So when the county cleared the lien and put the property on the surplus list, Basham's claim had no standing. He looked at her. You walked in before he understood that. Nell sat with that for a while. He knows I bought it. Mr. Garrett looked at the valley. He knows, he said. The first fire. She built it from hickory. She split herself from the woodlot behind the inn using a splitting maul she'd bought from a farm sale in Waynesboro for $8. The hickory was seasoned dry. She carried it inside in her arms load by load, stacking it beside the hearth on the hearthstone where firewood had been stacked for 69 years. She opened the Dutch oven. The cornmeal came from Mrs. Pruitt's feed store on the main road in Milford, a woman named Eunice Pruitt, who had run the store for 20 years and who had come out to the inn one Sunday afternoon with a box of supplies, cornmeal, eggs, butter, a jar of apple butter she put up herself in September, and a cast-iron skillet she thought might be useful. She had set the box on the porch and looked at the building for a long moment and said, Ada Carey bought cornmeal from my mother's store for 20 years. When I heard Ada's granddaughter was at the old inn, I figured you'd need cornmeal before you'd need anything else. She had come back the following Sunday, and the one after that. Always with something. Nell raked the coals, red-orange, 400 degrees, the right temperature for baking. She mixed the batter, poured it into the Dutch oven, set the Dutch oven in the ashes, raked coals onto the lid with the hand-forged rake from the tool roll in the cellar. She did not peek. The sizzle started. The sound filled the common room in a way that no other sound filled it, because the room was built to hold this sound, the stone and limestone and heavy timber, absorbing it, the way rooms built for specific purposes always absorb the sounds of those purposes. The room had held this sound for 69 years, and then silence for 112, and now on a Wednesday evening in October, the sound was back. The sizzle slowed, the smell shifted, cornmeal to toast. The specific warm, sweet smell of cornbread baking over hardwood coals in a stone hearth, which was not the same as cornbread baking in an oven, which was not the same as cornbread baking on a flat top, which was none of those things, because it was this exact smell that had filled this room for 69 years and had been absent from it for 112 and was now on this evening back. Nell lifted the lid, golden on top, brown on the bottom, the crumb dense and moist and right. She sat on the floor of the common room and ate the first slice in the firelight and thought about Ada, who had stood at a stone hearth on Route 11 for 28 years, Ada, who had walked this road 17 times, Ada, who had taught Nell to read fire by its color and read bread by its smell and read beans by their patience, Ada, who had known about this hearth all along. She set Ada's photograph on the limestone mantel above the hearth, the 1988 photograph. Ada, at the boarding house hearth, face lit by coals, the look of a woman doing the exact thing she was supposed to be doing. She hung the copper ladles from the crane hooks. She set the trivets on the hearthstone. She placed the guest ledger on a wooden stand she built from scrap lumber and set it on the mantel beside the photograph, open to the first page. April 3rd, 1843. Mr. William Crane, Staunton to Natural Bridge, traveling by stage, the first guest. The hearth looked complete. The hearth looked like it was waiting for the next pot. Word moved the way word moved in the Shenandoah Valley. not by social media and not by newspaper, and mostly by people telling other people in the way people had been telling other people things in this valley since before there was a valley turnpike. Within 2 weeks, Mrs. Pruitt had told everyone at the feed store. Mr. Garrett had told everyone at the county office. And a woman named Mrs. Ardell, who ran the historic interpretation programs at a restored frontier site in Staunton, had heard from someone who had heard from Mr. Garrett that a young woman had reopened the Oren's Rest Inn and was cooking on the original hearth and the original spit Jack was turning. Mrs. Ardell had driven out on a Saturday afternoon and stood in the doorway of the common room and watched Nell turn a chicken on the spit and stir a pot of beans on the crane and pull cornbread from the Dutch oven in the ashes, and she had tasted the beans and said simply, "Where did you learn?" "My grandmother's boarding house," Nell said. "I have been running hearth cooking programs at our site for 15 years. She looked at the crane and the spit jack and the ledger on the mantle. "What you just served me is the real thing. I want to bring my board out here, if you're willing." "Tell me more about that," Nell said. Roy came on a Wednesday. Roy was 65 years old and had been driving the same freight route between Roanoke and Winchester since 1989 and had eaten at Ada's boarding house 3 times a week from 1993 until Ada sold the business. He had read about the inn in a small article in the Augusta County paper and had driven 30 miles off his route. He stood in the common room and looked at the hearth for a long time. Then he walked the length of the room, ran his hand along the crane arm, looked up at the spit jack, looked at the photograph of Ada on the mantle. He sat down at the table nearest the hearth without being invited. "Can I get a plate?" he said. "Yes," she said. She brought him cornbread. He ate the first bite. He set his fork down. He looked at the fire for a long time. "Ada taught you," he said. "It wasn't a question. Every day from the time I was 5, Nell said. He nodded slowly. "The way you nodded when something confirmed something you already believed." "I could tell," he said. "The fire tastes different when someone who was taught right cooks on it." He picked his fork back up. She'd have been glad. He came back the following Wednesday, and the one after that. The spit jack was the part that surprised everyone. Not the crane, not the hearth, not even the copper ladles, but the spit jack, the clockwork weight and gear mechanism that had been sitting in the right wall of the firebox since 1843 was what made people stop and stare, because it still worked. The mechanism was intact. The gears were green with age, but the clockwork was functional, and when Nell had cleaned it and oiled it and reset the weight, it had begun to turn, slowly, steadily, with the patient ticking of something that had been built to last and had simply been waiting for someone to wind it. A chicken on the spit, turning over the fire, basking itself in its own juices as it rotated the skin, going golden in the radiant heat of the firebox. The way it had turned for 69 years, the way it turned now. Colt Basham's truck was a black F2 50 new with a company logo on the door that said Basham Land Group. He parked in front of the inn on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after Nell moved in and sat in the truck for a moment before he got out, the way people sat in their vehicles when they were preparing themselves for a conversation they had decided in advance. He was 55 years old, with the posture of a man who had won enough negotiations to believe that winning was his natural state. Not loud, not aggressive, precise in the way that people were precise when they had learned to use precision as leverage. He came through the door without knocking. Nell was sanding the crane arm where it joined the wall pivot. She didn't put down the sandpaper. He looked around the room, the restored crane, the fire in the hearth, the spit jack turning now slowly, its brass gears moving for the first time in 112 years with the weight that she had reset. He looked at the ledger on the mantle. He looked at the copper ladles on the hooks. "Miss Carey," not a question. "Yes," she said. Colt Basham, Basham Land Group. He reached into his coat and produced a folder. I had an agreement with Augusta County regarding this property, he said. He opened the folder. On the plank table she'd built from scrap chestnut. Documents, survey maps, letters on county letterhead, a contract with 2 signatures dated 3 years prior. Nell looked at the documents without touching them. A development agreement, he said. Mixed-use hospitality and commercial. The county co-signed on behalf of the property while the title was in their control. He tapped the contract. This agreement predates your deed. Nell looked at him. The county sold me this property, she said. The county may not have had the authority to sell it outright while an active development agreement was pending review. He said it without emphasis, like reading weather data. I'm not here to be adversarial, Miss Carey. I'm simply informing you that this situation is more complicated than a $10 deed makes it appear. She held the sandpaper. She looked at the folder, and then she looked at him. You've been in the cellar, she said. He was still, very still for half a second. I don't know what but the wooden box on the stone shelf, she said. The hatch on the lid. It has a specific way of opening. You have to lift and press at the same time because the wood swelled. You described the pouch inside as canvas. She set the sandpaper down. I didn't say canvas. I said pouch. You said canvas because you saw it. Basham's face did not change. I've reviewed historical documentation about You were in the cellar, Nell said. Before I bought the deed, you went down there. You found the box. She looked at him. You couldn't open it, so you needed the deed transferred so you could come back with more time. The room was very quiet. The spit jack ticked. Basham closed the folder. I'm giving you 30 days, he said, before I take this to the county court. He picked up the folder. Think carefully about what you want to do here. He left. The oak door closed. Nell stood in the center of the common room for a long time. Okay, stop. He has a contract. He was in the cellar. He knows about the gold. He's been watching this property for years, and he blocked Ada for years. And now he's here with documents and 30 days and the reasonable manner of a man who knows he's already won. She thought about the gold coins in the bank account she'd opened in Staunton. She could pay him, could probably pay him enough to make the problem go away without a court proceeding, write a check, buy her way clear, still have money left. She looked at the photograph of Ada on the mantle. Ada had tried 17 times. Ada had walked this road for 20 years and had been blocked at every turn by a man who filed objections and waited and moved slowly towards something he wanted and had no particular reason to hurry because the thing he wanted wasn't going anywhere. Ada had never made it through the door. She stood with her back to the hearth and the fire at her shoulders, and she looked at the door, and she thought about what it meant to use Ada's money to pay the man who had stopped Ada. She thought about that for a long time. No, she went to stoke the fire. Ren Oren drove from Charlottesville on a Friday. Nell heard the car on the road before she saw it, a Volvo older, with the unhurried sound of something being driven by someone who had already decided to come, and the decision was made and arrival was only a matter of time. She was on the porch replacing a hinge on the front door when the car parked. The woman who got out was 62, with gray hair cut short and the kind of careful posture that came from having thought about posture for a long time. She wore a coat that had seen many seasons, and she carried a leather folder under one arm. She looked at the building for a moment with an expression Nell could not immediately read. Not nostalgia, exactly. Something older and more settled than nostalgia. Something like recognition. She came up the porch steps. She looked at Nell. You're Ada Carey's granddaughter, she said. Yes, Nell said. I'm Ren Oren. My grandfather was Samuel Oren. She looked at the door. He closed this in the year my father was born. Nell's hands were still on the hinge. Wren looked at her. "I didn't come to make a claim," she said. "I want you to know that first. The building belongs to you. The ledger belongs to you. Whatever is in that cellar belongs to you. My family has no claim, and I don't want one." Nell waited. "I came because my family has been holding something," Wren said, "for whoever came here, for the right person." She looked at the leather folder under her arm. "My grandfather wrote a letter when he closed this inn. He kept it with the inn's papers with the accounts and the records and the correspondence because the building went to the county and he couldn't leave it inside. The letter wasn't for his family. It was for whoever came back to this hearth." She held out the folder. "My mother told me specifically when someone from the Carey family comes to this inn, you give her this." She paused. "My mother held it for 40 years. I've held it since she died. Your grandmother came close several times, but she never crossed the threshold." Nell took the folder. "How did you know I was here?" she said. "Mr. Garrett called me." Wren said it simply. "He's known about the letter for years. He was waiting for the right moment." She looked at the inn. "He said you bought it for $10 and lit the hearth the first week." "I did." "Then this is yours." She looked at Nell steadily. "My grandfather would have been glad." She did not come inside. She walked back to the Volvo and drove away. Nell stood on the porch with the leather folder and listened to the sound of the car on the valley road until it was gone. The folder was heavy, with the kind of weight that accumulated when something had been held for a long time in trust. She went inside. She set the folder on the plank table. She stoked the fire. The room was warm. The firelight moved across the limestone walls in long, shifting shapes that made the room look alive. The copper ladles turned slightly on the crane hooks in the updraft from the fire. She sat down at the table. She opened the folder. Inside, a single letter written on heavy ragstock in Samuel Oren's hurried but legible hand. But this letter was different from the cellar letter. The cellar letter had been addressed to whoever finds this impersonal forward-facing, a letter to the future written without a specific recipient. This one began, "To the Carey family." She sat with that for a moment. Then Basham's filing came in the mail, the formal notification of legal challenge, Augusta County District Court, a challenge to the validity of the $10 deed transfer based on the pre-existing development agreement. Nell stood in the common room, holding the court letter in one hand and Samuel Oren's unread letter in the other. The spitjack ticked. The fire needed feeding. She fed the fire first, because a cold hearth was not a hearth, and a hearth that had been cold for 112 years and was finally burning again was not going cold because a man named Colt Basham had filed a court document. She fed the fire. She set Samuel Oren's letter on the mantel beside Ada's photograph. She would read it when she was ready. She was not quite ready yet, because first she had to think about what she was doing and what she was willing to do, and whether she was the kind of person who would stand in this room and hold this ground. It was not about $10 or $25,000 in gold coins or even the building itself. It was about what Ada had walked toward for 20 years and never reached. It was about Maggie Carey eating at this hearth in 1897 and being written down not just by name, but by what she knew. This woman knows the smell of right fire, which was not a note about cornmeal, which was a note about the kind of person who walked into a place built for feeding people and understood without being told what the place was for. Nell looked at the fire. Ada had tried 17 times and been blocked 17 times and had still cooked on her own hearth on Route 11 for 28 years and fed every person who came through her door and had never stopped walking toward this one. And then she had died and given Nell the Dutch oven and said, "Wherever you end up, this goes." A direction, not a gift. She looked at the court letter. She looked at Samuel Oren's letter on the mantel. She looked at the fire. She said to the room, to the photograph, of Ada to the copper ladles and the spit jack and the limestone walls that had been standing since 1843. I hear you, Ada. I'm not going anywhere. Then she sat down at the table, and she read Samuel Oren's letter to the Carey family all the way through once. Then she sat very still. Then she read it again. Outside, the November wind came down from the Allegheny ridgeline and moved through the valley the way it always had, past the low limestone rise where the inn stood, with smoke coming from the chimney in a thin, straight column, thin and straight in the still air, the way smoke rose from a fire built correctly, the way smoke had risen from this chimney for 69 years and had then been absent for 112 and was now tonight back, which meant the hearth was burning, which meant someone was home. Part 3, Feed the Traveler. Samuel Oren had written in a hurry, not the careless hurry of someone who didn't care about the words, the specific hurry of someone who had a great deal to say and understood that time was limited and had decided that the most important things needed to be said first and everything else could follow or not follow depending on how much time there was. The letter was 3 pages, dense, both sides of each sheet, the handwriting starting tight and controlled and then loosening as he went, the letters growing larger toward the end of each page as if his hand was trying to keep pace with what his mind was producing and finding the pace difficult. To the Carey family. I do not know which of you will read this or when. I know only that you will come eventually, because certain kinds of people are drawn to certain kinds of places, the way iron is drawn to a specific kind of stone, and the drawing cannot be helped and cannot be explained beyond the fact that it is so. Margaret Carey Maggie, as she asked to be called, came to this inn 3 times, 1897, 1903, and 1908. The first time my father served her. The second time I served her myself, and my father noted afterward that she was the kind of woman who ate without asking what was in the pot, which he considered the highest compliment he could pay to any traveler who sat at our table. The third time I served her again, and my father was ill in the back room, and she sat at the table nearest the hearth and watched me work without saying anything for a long time, and then she said, "You know what you're doing?" I said, "I hope so." She said, "No. I mean, you know what this is for. Not everyone does." I didn't have an answer for that. I went back to my work, and she went back to her supper, and we did not talk again. But I have thought about that conversation many times in the 4 years since, because she was right, and because the observation was more precise than it sounded. There are people who understand a hearth the way you understand something you were born to understand, not as a heat source, not as a cooking surface, but as a commitment. The commitment is you come through this door and you will be fed, and while you are being fed, nothing else is required of you. Not your name, not your business, not your money if you haven't got it, not your alliance or your politics or your side of whatever argument is happening out on the road. You come in, we feed you, you go back out when you're ready. My grandfather Caleb understood this. My father understood it. I understood it, and I believe I have done it for the 18 years I have run this house. And now the house is closing because the motor car has ended, the stagecoach and the stagecoach inn is ending with it. And I am writing this letter because someone needs to know that the commitment doesn't end when the inn closes. A hearth is not a building. A hearth is an understanding between 2 parties. One makes the fire and one comes in from the cold, and both of them hold up their end. When Maggie Carey sat at this table, she was not only eating, she was honoring what the hearth offered, which is something not every person who walks through the door is willing to do. Some people eat defensively, as if accepting food from a stranger means accepting an obligation they don't want. Some people eat without noticing, which is its own kind of refusal. Maggie Carey ate the way the hearth was meant to be received. She tasted it. She paid attention. She said, "You know what this is for. That is why I am writing to her family, because this fire has to live somewhere after this inn closes. It lives in the tools I am leaving in the cellar, which are the tools we use to make the food. It lives in the ledger I am leaving there too, which is the record of everyone who ate here and was fed. And it lives, I believe, in the people who understood it." Maggie Carey understood it. "I believe someone in her family will come back here someday. I believe they will open this building and light the hearth. I believe this because the same instinct that brought Maggie here 3 times will bring someone else here again. When that happens, I want that person to know this hearth was built to feed people, every person, the traveler who can pay and the traveler who cannot, the traveler who is easy and the traveler who is difficult, the traveler heading north and the traveler heading south, regardless of what north and south meant in 1862 when this valley was a battlefield and men on both sides came through this door, and my grandfather fed them all without asking which color coat they'd left outside. There is no better proof of what a hearth is for than the fact that it could do that. Feed the next traveler. I will trust the fire to find the right hands." Samuel Orrin, March 1912. Nell set the letter down on the plank table. She sat there for a long time, because here was the thing. Ada had tried 17 times to get through that door. For 20 years, Basham had blocked her, and the county had delayed her, and the title had been complicated, and the complications had been real, and then the complications had been engineered, and Ada had never made it through. But Ada had known about Maggie, had known that Maggie had eaten here 3 times and been noted in the ledger, not just by name but by what she knew. Ada had grown up with that story the way you grew up with the stories that gave your family its sense of itself, not as facts to be verified, but as truths to be carried. And Ada had cooked on a stone hearth for 28 years, and Ada had taught Nell to cook on a stone hearth, and Ada had given Nell the Dutch oven and said, "Wherever you end up, this goes." Not a gift of an object, a direction across time. Nell looked at the photograph of Ada on the limestone mantel, the 1988 photograph, face lit by coals, the look of a woman doing what she was supposed to be doing. Ada had not made it through the door, but she had made sure Nell would. She pressed both palms flat on the chestnut surface of the table, old and cool and solid, the way you put your hands on something real when the world had just shifted in a way that needed anchoring. Then she got up and went to stoke the fire. Mrs. Ardell came on a Wednesday with a man named Dr. Hartley from the Virginia Historical Society. He was in his 50s with the careful manner of someone who handled fragile things professionally and had learned to keep his excitement controlled in order to preserve what caused it. He sat at the plank table and opened the guest ledger with gloved hands. He turned the pages very slowly. He did not speak for a long time. Nell watched from across the room. She was stirring beans on the crane. She had learned in the weeks since she'd first lit the hearth to continue working while things happened around her, because a hearth that went unattended produced food that no one wanted to eat. The beans needed watching. The world could do what it needed to do while she watched the beans. Dr. Hartley stopped on a page. He looked at it for a very long time. Then he said, "Miss Carey, come look at this." She came to the table. He pointed to the entry, September 14th, 1862, a list of names, 7 of them, 2 with unit designations she recognized from her reading as Union regiments, 3 with Confederate markings, 2 with nothing, just a name and a direction. All 7 of them, Dr. Hartley said, ate here on the same day. He turned the page. October 3rd, 1862, 5 more names, mixed, same pattern. He kept turning. The Civil War pages ran from 1861 to 1865. Dozens of entries, both sides, sometimes on the same day, sometimes a day apart, but always the same ledger, the same handwriting. Caleb Orrin's careful script recording everyone who sat at the table, regardless of which army they belonged to, recording them with the same information he recorded everyone else: name, direction of travel, date. No notation of conflict, no notation of difficulty, just names and dates and directions. There are 2 known guest ledgers from Valley Turnpike Inns covering this period in the Virginia State Archives, Dr. Hartley said. His voice was quiet and precise. Neither of them has entries like this. The practice of feeding soldiers from both sides documented this consistently in the innkeeper's own hand for the full duration of the war is unique. He looked at Nell. This is an extraordinary historical document. Mrs. Ardell said, tell her what that means. Dr. Hartley looked at the ledger. He said, it means that with an emergency nomination, this building could be placed on the Virginia Landmarks Register under expedited review. The provision exists for cases where a property faces imminent threat. He looked at Nell. Once nominated under that provision, no development or demolition can proceed while the application is under review. Nell said, how long does the review take? Dr. Hartley said, typically 6 to 12 months. Mrs. Ardell said, long enough. The nomination was filed on a Thursday. The building went on to the Virginia Landmarks Register's emergency review list on a Friday. While Dr. Hartley worked, Nell kept cooking, because that was what the room was for. Not the paperwork, not the legal proceedings, not the academic documentation of what Caleb Orrin had done in 1862 when the valley was a battlefield and hungry men on both sides came to this door. The room was for the beans simmering on the crane and the pot roast in the heavy iron pot and the cornbread in the Dutch oven in the ashes. The room was for the work, and the work did not pause for history. Basham's attorney called Mr. Garrett on the following Monday. Mr. Garrett relayed the conversation to Nell in his careful, unhurried way, standing on the porch of the inn in the November cold with his hands in his coat pockets. Basham's attorney has reviewed the development contract, Mr. Garrett said, specifically the section that requires all county co-signatories to hold active positions at the time of any legal enforcement proceeding. He looked at the valley. The council member who co-signed that contract was removed from office 14 months ago following an ethics review. The contract's enforcement mechanism requires a current official. There is no current official. Nell looked at him. It was never a valid contract, she said. It was never a ratified contract, he said. There's a distinction. Basham used it to create the appearance of a claim without actually having one, which is useful for slowing things down, but not for winning in court. He looked at the limestone walls of the inn. His attorney has informed me that the Basham Land Group will not be pursuing litigation at this time. At this time. That careful, retreating language. Nell said, is he gone? Mr. Garrett said, for now. She nodded. She went inside. She sat on the hearthstone with the fire behind her and thought about Ada walking this road 17 times, about Basham filing objections year after year, patient and deliberate the way certain kinds of people were patient when they believed the thing they wanted was not going anywhere and they had time. Ada had known about the hearth, had walked toward it for 20 years, had been turned away by paperwork and by one man's slow interference and by the accumulated weight of complications. And then she had died and given Nell the Dutch oven. Nell pressed her hands against her eyes for a moment, not crying. She had been conserving herself for things that required being functional and standing in front of a fire in a building that had been trying to find its way back to the right hands for 112 years was not a moment for losing the ability to function. She was fine. She was completely fine. Her face was wet. She wiped it on her sleeve and went to put more wood on the fire. The first public meal happened on a Saturday in November. Not an event exactly, not a formal dinner, just what it had always been, a hearth open to whoever came through the door. Nell had put the word out through Mrs. Pruitt and Mr. Garrett and Roy, which was to say, she had told those 3 people, and they had told everyone else within 30 miles because that was how information traveled in Augusta County when the information was worth traveling. 61 people came. They came through the oak door with its iron strap hinges and stood in the common room and looked at the limestone walls and the crane with the copper ladles on it and the spitjack turning slowly in the right wall of the hearth and the smoke going up the flue that had been cleaned and was drawing well. Most of them had nothing to say for the first minute or so, which was appropriate, because the room had a quality of presence that certain rooms had the quality of having held a great deal of specific human activity for a very long time, and the appropriate response to that presence was a moment of recognition before the talking started. Mrs. Pruitt had brought cornmeal, 4 bags of it in a box, which she set on the plank table without being asked. A woman named Hazel from down the road had brought dried beans 2 pounds, which she said had come from her own garden. 3 other women had brought things butter, an apple cobbler already made and needing only warming a pot of beef stew that turned out to be the best Nell had smelled since Ada's boarding house. She cooked from 5 in the morning, cornbread in the Dutch oven in the ashes, beans on the crane hung at the right height for simmer not boil, pot roast in the large iron pot on the lowest hook where the heat was gentlest and the time was longest, the spit jack turning a chicken slowly in the radiant heat of the firebox, the brass gears ticking their small, patient rhythm. By noon, the room smelled like 69 years of this hearth and 12 weeks of Nell cooking on it, and something older than either the accumulated smell of a place that had been doing one thing for a very long time and was doing it again. Roy came early. He drove 40 miles off his route and parked in front of the inn at 11 in the morning and came through the door and stood in the room the way he always stood in rooms that mattered to him carefully, as if he understood that he was a guest and the room had not invited just anyone. He looked at the hearth. He looked at the photograph of Ada on the mantel. He looked at the guest ledger on its wooden stand beside it, open to the first page. April 3rd, 1843, Mr. William Crane, the first guest. He sat down at the table nearest the hearth. He did not ask what was cooking. He did not look for a menu, because there was no menu, because this was not that kind of place. He sat down the way you sat down at a hearth table, with the expectation that you would be fed, with the understanding that you were not owed anything beyond that, and that the fact of being fed was itself enough. Nell brought him cornbread first. He ate the first bite. He set his fork down. He said very quietly, "Same hands." Nell did not answer. She went back to the fire. Mrs. Ardell came with 4 members of her board from the historic site in Staunton. They ate at the long table and talked about the ledger and the spitjack and the emergency nomination and the significance of the Civil War entries. Dr. Hartley had already submitted a preliminary report to the Virginia Historical Society. There would be more people wanting to see the ledger. There would be an official preservation assessment. There would be paperwork and committees and the slow institutional machinery of making something official. Nell noted all of this. She kept cooking because the beans needed attention and the pot roast needed checking and the cornbread was due to come out in 12 minutes and none of that paused for paperwork. Ren Oren came at 2 in the afternoon. She came quietly the way she had come the first time, parked the old Volvo, walked to the door, came through without ceremony. She did not join a group. She got a plate and sat at the small table in the corner nearest the hearth and ate slowly, looking at the fire, looking at the spitjack turning, looking at the copper ladles on the crane hooks, looking at the guest ledger on the mantel. Nell watched her from across the room. Ren caught her eye. She nodded once. That was all. It was enough. Near the end of the afternoon, when the crowd had thinned and the fire was lower and the last of the cornbread had been eaten and the beans were reduced to the bottom of the pot and the pot roast was bones and memory, Nell went to the mantel. She took down the guest ledger. She carried it to the plank table and sat down. The last entry was still there on the last page. March 14th, 1912. Mr. James Doyle, Richmond to Lexington, traveling by motor car. The last guest. God keep the road. 112 years. 112 years between that entry and the day she was sitting here in the same room at the same table with the same hearth burning behind her. She opened the ledger to the next page, the first blank page. She took the pen from her pocket, a simple pen, not a fountain pen, not the kind of pen that made a production of the writing, just a pen. She thought for a moment about what Caleb Orrin had written at the top of the very first page in 1843. The heading in his careful hand: name, origin, destination, date. She thought about what Samuel Orrin had written at the bottom of his last page, the last guest, God keep the road. She thought about Maggie Carey sitting at this table in 1897 and eating without asking what was in the pot, and being noted in the record not just by name, but by what she understood. She wrote at the top of the blank page, Milford, Virginia, November, and below it the first new entry, Roy Saunders, Waynesboro to Winchester, traveling by truck, has eaten at Ada Carey's table every week since 1992, was waiting for this one. Below that, Eunice Pruitt, Milford, has brought cornmeal every Sunday since October, was waiting. Below that, after a pause, Ren Orrin, Charlottesville, last of the Orrin family, has been holding something for the right person for many years, has delivered it. She stopped. She thought about Ada. She thought about Ada walking this road 17 times and being turned away 17 times, and never once, as far as Nell could tell, from everything she knew about Ada, becoming bitter about it. Ada had gone home and cooked on her own hearth and taught Nell to read fire by its color and bread by its smell, and she had died in her chair with the ladle warm in her hands, and then she had given Nell the Dutch oven and said, wherever you end up, this goes. Nell wrote, Ada M. Carey, Milford, Virginia, was trying to get here for 20 years, did not make it through the door, but made certain her granddaughter would. Then she wrote the final entry on the first new page, Nell Carey, Milford, Virginia, came through the door, lit the fire, will feed whoever comes next. She capped the pen. She put it in her pocket. She carried the ledger to the mantel and set it back on its stand, open now to the new page. Not the last page, the first new page. The fire was lower but not out. She built it up again with 3 pieces of hickory from the pile beside the hearth pieces she had split and carried in and stacked with the care of someone who understood that a hearth required ongoing attention and that the attention was not a burden. It was the whole point. The room was quieter now, a few people still at tables, Roy still in his corner, Wren still by the hearth. The spitjack ticked. The crane turned slightly in the updraft. Outside, the November light was going. The valley was going gold in the last of the afternoon sun, the way the valley went gold at this hour, at this time of year, which was the way it had gone gold in November when Caleb Orrin was alive and when his son was alive and when Samuel was alive and when Maggie Carey walked the road and when Ada walked the road and when Nell drove from Staunton with a $10 bill and a Dutch oven and a photograph. The light did not care about any of that. The light just did what it did. The valley did what it had always done, and the hearth burned because someone had fed it, because that was the whole of the inheritance, not the gold coins in the bank account, not the deed on the county record, not the ledger now open to a new page with new names in new handwriting. The hearth burned because someone understood what it was for, and that was enough, and it had always been enough. Nell looked at the photograph of Ada on the mantel one more time. Then she went to check on the fire.